So, Sohrab, you give your new book the title, "The Unbroken Thread." Why a thread? What means this? To use the right's online lingo, what does that mean?
Well, thank you for having me. The title of the thread refers to the thread with which I hope to bind my son, who is now 4 years old. He was 2 years old when I started writing the book, and his name is Maximilian. So it's the thread I'm hoping to use to tie my Maximilian to the idealism and tradition that is represented by his namesake, who is Saint Maximilian Kolbe, a Polish Franciscan friar who was canonized as a martyr in the Catholic Church for stepping into the shoes of someone else who was condemned to be killed at Auschwitz. And that person cried out, I have a wife, I have children. And although St. Maximilian wasn't one of the men chosen to die, he chose to step in this person's place, and he died as a result. So to me, the life of Maximilian Kolbe is a sort of perfect life and a perfect death. And the perfection of it, I think, is made possible by a kind of deep grounding in the virtues, in traditional authority, the authority of the church, the authority of religion more broadly. And it's an act of his decision to do that, to me, is an act of perfect freedom made under conditions in which you can't imagine there would be any freedom. And as I write in the book, he in a sense tells his captors, the Nazis, that I'm freer than you, in choosing to lay down his life for a stranger. So, but as I also write, I'm very worried about the shape of our culture, of what it will mold out of what it will chisel out of my son. So I decided to write this book in order to strengthen the thread that binds the Saint Maximilian to my Maximilian. So the best image that I could find is a thread and a binding. One more note, very briefly, and just that the whole book is every chapter, poses one question that challenges one of our kind of modern secular liberal orthodoxies, and it explores them through the life of one great thinker. This is my way of kind of guiding my son without, hammering things over his head, but just to sort of bring him along in a more kind of in a way that's respectful of him as he grows up and is able to read this book. Each of the chapters ends up having the same theme ultimately, which is that things that appear to limit us, bind us, set up barriers before our will are actually sources of liberation, whereas things that seem to be liberating us by demolishing those barriers, tendencies, developments, social, cultural phenomena, actually make us less free. And this is a very old theme, as you know, in all of kind of not just the Christian tradition, but the classical tradition, that true freedom is found actually in limits, and hence again thread, binding, and so forth.
Yeah, I actually cried during this early part of the book that you're describing. I had never heard this story somehow, shamefully. It's a gap in my education.
I hadn't heard of it until I was 31. So.
Oh, okay. All right.
You're blameless.
So I read it out loud to my wife, and I saw tears well up in her eyes as well. And for some reason, the next day I worked harder. And then the following day after that, I worked harder. I just thought, what are the things that I'm complaining about? It's
right.
It's unbelievable the kind of privilege I have to live my life with such freedom. What did you learn about freedom? I know you kind of touched on this from his story. Why is Father Kolb's story and his brand of freedom, how is this at odds with the kind of freedom that we're selling to young people in the West today?
Yeah, so our brand of freedom roughly says that freedom means being able to choose from as many contraries as possible. So choice is the ability to choose in itself is freedom, and it really doesn't matter what you choose. You are free to either marry or divorce. You are free to either donate your wealth to charity or to hoard it, irresponsibly and selfishly, and so on. So if you are unrestrained, you are free, and the more unrestricted you are or unrestrained you are, the freer you are. But again, as you know, because of the name of the podcast, the classical definition of freedom is not actually that, and this version of freedom arose relatively recently in the history of our species, maybe like 300-400 years ago, and it came as a shock to the pre-existing traditions that predated it and against which it reacted. In those cases, freedom was really true. Freedom was freedom to do what you ought to do, and therefore, the truly free person is one who aligns his life with an objective moral order and lives a life of virtues, and ultimately masters himself or herself. And so we see that, obviously, that kind of profound self-mastery in the choice of a priest to choose to die for someone else's sake, in a kind of echo of the Christ event. So I guess that's what I see in that story. It doesn't mean that today people don't make sacrifices or don't do the kinds of things that the actions that Maximilian Kolbe took. A lot of people do actually, in fact, do that. Parents, will do incredible things for their children. They'll forego many things. We saw obviously that kind of heroism of nurses and doctors and frontline health workers. But I argue that if those things are happening, they're happening in spite of and no thanks to kind of the ideology of freedom that we've built. If everyone really took seriously the kind of ethos of the West today, we would see an even more selfish society, and even more kind of abjectly irresponsible society. We don't, because people still have, inklings of a higher way of being in the world, and so they do it. But again, I insist that they do it in spite of what they're told freedom is about.
So you talk in your book about your journey coming to America as an immigrant from Iran, and seeing Iran as being repressive and backwards, seeing America then as this great place of openness, a place of tolerance, a place of diversity and individual autonomy. And you even talk a little bit about your own experiments in self-definition, your own sort of libertinism when you were younger. But something shifted, and I found myself curious about exactly what that was. You said in your book that you had come to believe that the, quote, Western dream of autonomy and choice without limits is, in fact, a prison. And you were just speaking about that. But I found myself wanting to know more about this. What changed? What snapped in you? And how did this shift in your thinking come about?
Two factors. One is a conversion to Roman Catholicism that, in my case, took place when I was 31 years old, which is about when I encountered the story of St. Maximilian. And so as soon as you enter the sort of the world of the teachings of the Catholic Church, it's not just its theological teachings, which are a product of revelation, but the Church has a vision of, obviously, ethics and social life, of how to order social life, which is based on the kind of natural law tradition, based on virtue ethics, and heavily, frankly, Aristotelian. And so that's a very different account of freedom. It's the account of freedom that the moderns really rose up against. And And it sort of, because I was, an immigrant and kind of enamored of the West and of its liberal tradition, broadly speaking, I had drank very deeply from that tradition. I knew it. I had read, the things you read, John Stuart Mill, blah, blah, blah. And then to suddenly encounter this other tradition, which in college, I had opportunities to read Aristotle and Plato, but I would kind of just be like, why are we reading this? Like, hasn't this been overcome? Why are we even bothering with kind of these museum pieces? Now we have modernity, and this was obviously wrong because it's old.
Right.
But then as a convert, to go back to that and really study and be like, okay, this is an entirely different way of being in the world. And it coincided with becoming a father. The minute you are responsible for the formation of another soul, in my case, I now have 2 children, you really, it shifts your perspective. I mean, I just at a very mundane level, I suddenly think in a way that I never did before, that I think about death. I think about the fact that I'm going to die. And so I have to pass on something. I have a limited amount of time to form my children. And that I live in a culture that, does a lot to attempt to make that a lot harder for me. I don't just mean like the obvious things, and some of the controversies that I'm known for about like kind of like these culture war hot button things, drag queen story hour or whatever, but just the whole ethos of it. I mean, so in the book I describe, imagining my Maximilian when he's out of college, and then I imagine him again when he's 47, which was the age at which his patron saint laid down his life for a stranger at Auschwitz. And I'm not saying he's, I'm a member of the kind of global elite. So I don't think, please God, that my kid will have that he's going to be like, I don't know, just an utter loser, at life in defining those material terms. He's probably going to go to an elite college, probably going to get, but my nightmare is that he's just this kind of bland, self-seeking person, like many, unfortunately, that I encounter in my real life today, where, all the kind of anxiety to really understand what the good life is, that drove ancient peoples, or kind of what is the examined life, blah, 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 is just completely irrelevant to them. They're just sort of like, okay, I check these boxes on my resume, and I talk about money, and I entertain myself, and that's it. Like, this is this kind of light, meaningless life that is not a serious life. So that was really the 2 key factors. Was, again, the kind of reintroduction to the church's vision of ethics and social thought, and then my own anxieties as a father, facing what I think is a culture that just deforms children unless you really combat it.
Yeah, and it's funny. You said that you only have so many years to form your child, and I think what you're getting at is that we live in a culture that insists that children should be able to form themselves, that they should be free from all heteronomous cultural constraints, that they are free to express their authenticity, right? Expressive individualism, and that sort of thing. And that was, I think, a passage in your book that really helped me understand better your entire argument and worldview. And I started getting my own sense of anxiety. And you wrote this. I want to read a quote from your book. You say, "No amount of gratitude can allay the anxiety that grips me when I ask myself, what kind of a man will contemporary Western culture chisel out of my son? Which substantive ideals should I pass on to him against the overwhelming cynicism of our age?" And you go on to talk about the anxiety that you have for your son. You're essentially worrying that he is going to become a soulless, credentialed elite who devotes his life to serving the false gods of money and status and prestige. And he's basically going to become a member of what Charles Murray calls the managerial are the new upper class, right?
Yeah.
What Burnham called the managerial elite. And you talk about your sort of own nightmare of your future, where your son is this sort of golden boy, diverse, hip, wealthy. He's working at some investment bank, and is just he's just walking around in this world that has no purpose for him. He's unmoored, right? And he's wealthy and successful beyond belief, and any parent would be proud, but he's spiritually and morally confused.
Right.
And as I was reading that, I was nodding my head, and then I was thinking, do you think these concerns are evidence of, as I share them with you, of our own sort of Western privilege? Like, I know at the charter school that I work at, I have a bunch of colleagues from India and China and Russia and things like that. And they're not making the same complaints that you are, because they're just happy that their kids have a chance to become a privileged, soulless elite. So what would you say? So are we sort of disconnected? Are you your own sort of, is there an elitism that comes out of your own view here for your son?
That's a really, really good question. And it's one that I have to say has always been in the back of my mind as I've written this book, that, I'm an immigrant, my wife's an immigrant, and from a cynical lens, you could say, America has been good enough to you, Sohrab Ahmari, that now you can have these boutique concerns. You come from Iran, my wife's Chinese, and you're both successful enough that, having risen to a certain kind of like status or comfort and kind of public prominence, that now you can worry about, like, will my kid read Aristotle? That is, in some sense, true. And it is the paradox of a society like America that invites successive waves of immigrants who may not have had the same opportunities to explore the life of the mind where they came from, possibly. And therefore, a certain subset begins to think, I'm a little dissatisfied with it. There must be more to life. And I'm worried about whether or not my own kids will be formed the right way in this civilization. That's not an entirely kind of unfair critique. And I think it's a critique I can make of the whole larger Sohrab Ahmari project, if you will, in the sense that it is taking place against the backdrop of having immigrated to the society and done well for myself, I suppose, and then, like you said, have the privilege to have these boutique concerns that maybe a lot of other immigrants don't share. But having said all that, I do think that the questions addressed in the book and the concerns about what kind of a civilization will what kind of children will this civilization form out of our kids is ultimately maybe the preserve of a kind of elite that can even begin to like worry about this stuff, but it nevertheless is dead serious. And I do know lots of of the kind of parents that you're talking about, who they may not be writing books about it because they're not writers, but they're immigrants, and they send their kids by working their butts off to like be able to afford sending their kids to like really elite private schools. And the way they formulate it is that all my kid learns is like kind of grievance studies and talk of like wokeness and who's which people in their class are like deserving victims and which ones are they may be Asians and they're treated as white adjacent and somehow guilty for in the kind of intersectional psychodrama they're cast as villains. Well, that's a kind of concern. That's a concern that kind of those class of immigrants have, and it ultimately goes back to these more fundamental questions that I try to address with the book. And bottom line, I would say in response to that, because again, it's a question that I've given a lot of thought to, that if a set of issues or philosophical questions is worth answering and is serious enough to engage serious people, whatever their background, then they should be engaged. And I'm not gonna be anxious about whether or not my mere fact of engaging them is a sign of a certain kind of privilege. It may be, but whatever. Like I want to talk about serious things, and so here we are.
Good. So you acknowledge the difficulty, right? The uphill battle, right? That a lot of people who are trying to raise their kids with traditional values have, right? In many ways, living your life according to traditional principles today, being an Orthodox Christian or an Orthodox Jew or something like that, is an uphill battle. It's very difficult. And you quote Rabbi Soloveitchik, who discusses accepting really a higher will, retreating rather than advancing, surrendering to God's law. And I think that goes along with what you were talking about, subordinating yourself to an objective moral order instead of trying to determine your own, right, Nietzschean values or whatever. This isn't an enticing message for a lot of people in the West right now. I have found that many of my students are just completely and totally morally relativistic. How does the traditionalist win with the odds stacked against him like this? Because I've found that young people today, they see you see moral absolutism, moral absolutes, having being grounded morally, having a set of moral absolutes. You see that as being much better than moral relativism. My students see moral absolutes as its own kind of tyranny. Mm-hmm. How do we get this message out that moral relativism isn't freedom? It's not particularly moral, right? If you're a moral relativist, you have absolutely no ground to stand on in order to criticize someone like Hitler, right? Mm-hmm. Because that's his culture. Who am I to say in all of this? Mm-hmm. How do we communicate this message? How does the traditionalist survive in this culture?
So a couple of points. One is that you're right that a lot of young people are kind of marinated in this kind of pop relativism and are told that they should sort of be entrepreneurs of themselves and to define what their true selves are. I would argue that the generation of my parents' generation, I come from a kind of like bohemian Iranian family, they took that impulse really to its extremes, the generation of 1968. So in my case, like my parents, this was in Iran, which is ostensibly a traditional society, but if you're growing up in the kind of liberal secular circles, which are pretty widespread in Iran, my parents, the only kind of moral grounding they gave me was be yourself. And be yourself is basically what the kids today are told, and you just said they're constantly seeking to define themselves, which is exhausting. First of all, and to reinvent the moral wheel daily. Like, who am I? What do I really believe? And without kind of thinking, well, I'm a human being. That comes with certain characteristics. I'm an animal. I'm animated by a soul, but I'm also a rational animal. There are certain things that are good for me. There are certain things that are bad for me, and you can grasp those things just by natural reason without any Bible or Quran in the picture. But anyway, all of this is alien to them, as you say. On the other hand, what I see in some of the woke ideology and the fervor with which, the students you're talking about bring them into is a kind of moral absolutism, right? They're seeking a kind of, they've been given this society and they see certain injustices. Now, what they pick at may not be they may not be going to the root of what dissatisfies them about the existing order. And I would argue a lot of the woke stuff, as revolutionary as it seems, actually just reinforces the kind of power and wealth hierarchies in our society. It's not actually a threat to the powers that be, which is why corporations and others just are happy to absolutely accommodate it.
It's a code that earns you entrance into the elite. Right? If you know how to speak woke, then you can succeed in America.
Absolutely. But on the other hand, that there is a kind of moral impulse embedded in it. And so how do we win? One of the ways, I think, is to say, you're making claims about what's just and unjust in race relations. And so you want to get at something like substantive justice. You think that the post-civil rights settlement wasn't enough because, and I can be sympathetic to this view that if a people were slaves for 400 years and then, or let's say 200 some years, and then afterward kind of lived under de jure apartheid, legalized apartheid, then you couldn't snap your fingers and say, well, you have rights now, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. There may be a need for a kind of substantive justice. I'm not saying it's reparations, whatever it may be. But if the kids are bringing this to the table, then there's an opening to say, so you think there is such a thing as justice, that you're not a relativist. There is right. Justice is giving each person his due. And right. That is an objective thing that you can grasp. And so now replicate that across all of life and see. So I guess that's trying to put an optimistic spin on it, that a lot of the theories of the young today in some ways may be channeled in a different direction, or could be a beginning of a dialogue if they're reasonable enough. On the other hand, I might just get canceled and there's no talking to them, and I'm just fooling myself.
Sohrab, I've said this before. I don't think this new woke Gen Z, millennial, I don't think this new generation they're not, I don't have the same concerns about them that I had about 1980s postmodern moral relativists. They're not moral relativists, actually. They are very certain that they are correct about a certain set of issues and very close-minded to hear about your deep sense of natural law and justice and faith and all of this stuff. So I don't think that they think they're moral relativists, and they talk like moral relativists sometimes, but I actually think that they're sort of quite morally certain. They're just leftists. And so how do we communicate the right values? You're talking about the fact that if they're just open to a conversation, maybe we could reach them. I don't think they're even open to the conversation. I think they're little Maoists, many of them.
No, it's true. And it certainly doesn't do, I think, as a lot of, certainly we could talk about how this plays out in media newsrooms, where the reaction of the older 50-something liberals who run the magazine or newspaper is when they see these young reporters and editors riled up about some piece, they right away say, oh, I'm sorry, like we're going to retract that piece and we're going to hold a town hall where there'll be dogs for you to pet to relieve your anxiety about the fact that we ran this abhorrent piece. So no, look, I think some of this has to come to political combat as well. And I think I've come to the view, which is interesting because if you know my intellectual history, I used to be very much of the left. And then I kind of became your standard issue, kind of right, liberal, conservative. I now increasingly see, as I said, the fact that the elite has completely adopted and accommodated itself to this new ideology tells me that it's a way to actually defer and not solve and not address real grievances and injustices in our society, of which I consider massive inequality to be one. The language of wokeness does not help the Amazon worker who is like hyper exploited, and Jeff Bezos gives him only 20 minutes time off task. And so he's in a warehouse, and as Alec McGillis documents in a really kind of searing new book on Amazon called One Click America, an older worker who needs to use the bathroom because the warehouse is so big and he only gets 20 minutes off task, they relieve themselves in bottles, right? And so that's like, and Jeff Bezos is worth $179 billion. So there are legitimate kind of old material grievances that should be addressed, which people like Jeff Bezos and the kind of professional managerial class who service them, they would much rather talk about very kind of the latest gender acronyms or whatever, because it's a way to not address, I think, the real injustices. And by the way, it becomes one more tool for the human resources department to fire you for saying the wrong thing. So I think that the point I'm getting at is this, that a successful kind of traditionalist pushback, if you will, comes in two directions. One is the kind of dialogue that I mentioned you could maybe have with the woke and with a kind of wider social audience to say, like, okay, we agree now that there is such a thing as justice. Well, let me tell you about justice as the ancients conceived of it. But the other one, and I think this is where traditionalists have thus far failed, is to fight to take the lead on the real kind of material economic issues, the injustices, which wokeness serves as a kind of mask. It hides it, distracts people, and ultimately serves as a cover for kind of a really unjust order. And so, there's a kind of religious conservatism that I'm increasingly kind of have zero patience for, which is, that just it laments, marriage rates are down, family formation is so low, childbearing rates are so low, church attendance rates are so low, but never says, like, well, what are the material conditions that make it harder for people to marry, to have children, to attend church, to have Sabbath with their family members, and so forth. So anyway, the point is that it's always good to be like, what are the material conditions that shape human beings' soul? Why is this ideology so successful among the elite? What purpose is it? How do they benefit from this ideology? And then you can begin to see the world as it is and begin to make political choices.
Yeah, your critique there reminds me of a lot of what Jordan Peterson often talks about. Love him or loathe him. He often talks about the way in which the failures of true Marxism in the 20th century, which, we don't want to go back to those, right? The Soviet Union and Maoist China and Cambodia, and we can just go down a list, East Germany and Romania, of totalitarian, of Marxist catastrophes, is what made the left pull a sleight of hand and move to a kind of cultural Marxism, a neo-Marxism, which is about pitting races against one another in a kind of intersectional hierarchy. And so you have that class struggle, right? Instead of the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, it's the coalition of the dispossessed races versus white Christian males, or something like that. How do you bend the stick in the opposite direction from this neo-Marxism without going back, without harping so much on class that we're no longer free anymore? I mean, I read I loved your chapter on the Sabbath, but I personally felt like I don't want Sabbath to be mandated. I personally feel like virtue resides in freedom. Like virtue isn't if you lock a drunkard in a cage without his whiskey, he becomes sober. But we don't praise him because he couldn't have done otherwise. Don't we want a virtuous? So I know that's a lot there to process, but don't we? So the first question is, how do we not bend the stick back too far, such that you're heading in the direction of the sort of Marxism, but how do we also keep the population free, right? Can we have a religious, virtuous populace through compulsion? That's you read my Quillette article, and one of the things that I suppose I was a little bit unfair to you, and I really wasn't meaning to be, but I find myself worried, and as a kind of old-fashioned classical liberal, I find myself worried with, with that kind of state compulsion.
Sure.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on the problem. What do you
Sure.
think?
Let me address the first one, which is, if conservatives begin to think about material realities, including social class, which is a material reality, that therefore their prescriptions will be like a return to 20th century Marxism. And the answer is no. To recognize that class is a material reality, it shapes how people live and work and exist in the world, is not to say that therefore that class distinctions should all be sort of forcibly abolished, because that goes against nature. And when the communist regimes did that, they had to resort to, the gulag and the killing field and the torture chamber to achieve that. And it ultimately wasn't. There was a new class of communist apparatchiks that formed basically the upper class of communist society. So to recognize class, I guess, to put on the lens of reality and say, well, yeah, there are distinctions between, is not to then adopt Marxist economic prescriptions, right? Because the right to private property is protected and is recognized in the natural law. From my particular tradition, the Catholic social teaching has always opposed that kind of Marxist socialism. But the two needn't go together. In other words, you can recognize that there are class injustices, but then think there are other solutions to it. So, for example, the way that the pre-moderns dealt with the problem of inequality wasn't to attempt to utterly abolish it, because, like I said, when we did attempt to do that, it resulted in mass horrors, but rather to find ways to bind elites to the populace. In other words, to create what the tradition calls servant elites. You are an elite not because you just got high test scores on your competitive exams and was admitted to a high-ranking college, and therefore you've now made it, you owe no responsibility to others, but rather you're an elite precisely because you're called to help order the whole society in a way that's beneficial to the whole, to the common good of the whole. You have to do certain. So, in other words, what I'm suggesting involves reforming our elites, because a lot of times our elites, precisely as I mentioned, they will they disregard all the ways in which they are the elite, thanks to cognitive advantages that is not their own in a way. It's just a kind of gift of nature, and also we know that elites reproduce themselves, so that across generations they will continue to be elites, and so it's not as meritocratic as they think. And there's an entire system that sustains them, and America is especially good at sifting elites out of everywhere and leaving behind essentially cities that are the left behind places. And so you can think about social policy, and I can suggest some, but the social policy to sort of reorient the elites so that they aren't sort of ruthless so-called meritocrats, without then opening the door to like socialism in the old in the old kind of Marxist fashion of the 19th and 20th centuries. To answer your other question about virtue being freely chosen, there I have to disagree. I mean, even under America's classically liberal regime, up until not too long ago, like decades ago, there was Sabbath laws, blue laws. In Massachusetts, I think it's where you're based. I don't know if you want to mention that.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Oh, it's fine.
I mean, Massachusetts is a very Puritan place, and it had pretty severe blue laws, and Sabbath laws, or trading bans for Sundays and so forth. I guess in a more pluralistic way, you could do it so that Muslims get theirs on Friday, Jews get theirs on Saturday, and Christians on Sunday. But so the bottom line is that it's not. If you think in a classically liberal fashion, I think it will bring us to the point where, like I said, anything that's is an unchosen obligation becomes an imposition, a kind of coercion. You have to look at ever more of the past as this horrendous place, right? And this is a very kind of liberal tendency where liberalism has, begins to look at all the past, all the periods of time, all the systems, including even America's, had these non-liberal elements, right? So, for example, blue laws is an example. And it's, well, that wasn't freely chosen. That wasn't freely chosen. And then ever more of the past becomes this like horror place, this land of icky things that we did in the past where we weren't fully free. Well, of course, life isn't like that. In reality, there's always some coercion. The question is, who is coercing for what purpose? Today, to stay with the Sabbath theme, what coerces people is not the law saying, let's carve out the half a day on Sundays to allow families to go to church or to be with each other. What coerces is companies that typically for working class people, they use algorithmic scheduling, and their whole purpose is to minimize their own labor costs. But that means that you have no sense of control over your own schedule, and there's a kind of precarious quality to when you work and when you don't. And so that means that parents often can't be with children in any kind of predictable way, and it has all sorts of social ramifications. It means we're all kind of rushed and no one quite ever gets to be together. That's a kind of coercion. It's just privately meted out. So there's no society in which some kind of coercion doesn't happen. And just because a private actor does it instead of a government doesn't make it not coercion. So I know this is kind of a windy, digressive answer, but the bottom line is that we have to not think of all these kinds of inherited obligations that came down from tradition or traditions as these horrific instances of coercion, and then ignore the coercion that happens in our own time. And I would just as a warning, I would say that when you begin to look at, well, people used to do this as a bad thing, the end of the line, so in other words, your position as the classically liberal at some point becomes the progressive liberal, right? Like, it's not enough that just sort of people should be free and so forth, but like we have to like actively make people free in every sense. And then some of the weird kind of like gender stuff, there's a continuum of liberalism where it begins with opposition to the Sabbath as an institution, which most societies across most of human history defended, or I guess it's a Western history. To it's not enough that I get to change my gender, but you have to sort of proactively recognize it because the past, my former name, Darren, cannot be said. My former name is a dead name, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So
these are all kind of anti-traditional impulses, that anything that I didn't choose was bad.
Yeah. Well, if you read my last two articles, my mind has been slowly changing on my classical liberalism, and I think what you're talking about is how a sort of negative rights regime the idea of freedom from government, freedom from, how that slowly begins to morph into a positive rights regime that's unconstrained, and all of a sudden now we have freedom to, and freedom to recognition, and my inner anything that would hinder my authentic self-expression is bad, and
therefore states and corporations have to legislate or act to prevent me from not. So that's exactly right, that the individualism and statism, or the individualism and the weird coercion that we all now kind of experience, go hand in hand. It's a weird kind of dynamic where the more individualized we are, the more we need structures, and some of them are private, but that doesn't mean they're not coercive, like corporations censoring you and so forth. The more individuals we are, we also need more structures to protect our individualness in a way that's kind of ever more unnatural. And I just, I've been like, just to speak very bluntly, it's been a long time since I've felt really free, and I can't quite describe it. Something has accelerated in the West, and I can't quite none of us can put our fingers on it. Obviously that we're living under lockdowns and so forth. That's a unique case. Although it's a kind of acceleration of a trend that existed before. But, I always ask people, like, do you feel free? What happened to the kind of classical liberals' promises? And they always say, like, if we go back in time, but it's like there's some tendency in the thing that I think is it's the working out of the logic of classical liberalism, not an aberration or departure from it, or a distortion of it.
As Patrick Deneen told me, radically individuated selves end up relying on and needing government even more. So in that sort of thing. Do you have time for a couple quick more questions? Two more questions?
Sure.
Okay. So we are in the midst of a pandemic. We've been locked down for over a year. What would you say right now are the biggest threats to religious liberty in America today? If you ask someone like David French, and I did say this to Jonah Goldberg when I spoke to him, I asked him, I said, you seem to me to be the type of guy who, I said, one of the things that frustrates me about you, Jonah, is that when I listen to your podcast, and I do listen to his podcast, you never talk about the culture war issues that seem to be impacting me every single day. And Amazon's going to ban Ryan Anderson's book, and your answer is it's the free market and it's a private company. And I said this literally to him in our conversation. I said, you seem to be the type of classical liberal conservative. When you walk in a restaurant and you get horrible service and the food is rotten, you say they're a private company, they can do what they want. I never hear you critiquing these companies. I never hear you talking about the trans issue. We can't share a country together if we can't agree on the definition of what a woman is.
Man and woman,
and I'm risking my career for saying that, but I have to, because I believe it's my job to defend the truth. So, and
what
I
is
just
the greatest threat?
Yeah. And so I wanted to, folks like David French are going to say, well, if we just have this neutral public square, and he says, I'm a lawyer, I've been fighting for religious liberty. And if you ask David French, he would say that we have more religious liberty in America today than we have had at any time. And I don't know if that's true. I think we're on the brink, given bills like the Equality Act that threaten to roll back religious institutions, making it impossible for churches to observe the tenets of their faith. So where do you come down? What are the major threats to religious liberty today? And as a second question there, how do we have a revived, healthier right that can actually address the problems that are going on today?
Okay. So on the first front, what is the greatest threats? I'll pick two. One is, and I have to say I was against lockdowns pretty early on. And it's interesting because a lot of people said, aha, you're not a classical liberal. You're supposed to not, worry about individual rights, which is again, that there's a tendency among liberals, and again, when I say liberals, I don't mean the left, I mean the kind of grounding philosophy of the West for the past 200-300 years, is anything that's not liberal must necessarily be lawless or irrational. Therefore, if you consider yourself a non-liberal, a post-liberal, as I do, then that must mean that you should like every government intrusion into private affairs, even if it's irrational. Any government restriction, even if it's irrational. So I think the possibility that now the elites have tasted, where anything that happens, they can say, well, we can only have 10 people in churches and they have to be whatever, many feet apart. And I don't think they will soon relinquish this power. And it's very scary. And I think, you could see them doing it with climate change. Like they have a graph, like if carbon emissions go beyond a certain thing, we have to shut down the economy. And notice like the people who can comply with them and even thrive amid those are large corporations, right? Not small business. It kills working class job. People like you and me in some ways who can work on our laptops, and so we're the professional class. And people like Jeff Bezos, who kind of owns everything, they thrive and they don't have any problem with this kind of order. And it'll lead to ever more kind of automation, mm-hmm. Right? And so these are the kinds of things I worry about, is that it was already happening, but that ever more of the things we took for granted as being embodied experiences, including in the Catholic faith, obviously because of its the centrality of the Eucharist and the centrality of things you touch and see and taste as part of its liturgies, will come under threat this way. The other one you already mentioned is private threats to religious liberty and freedom of expression, which again are not, for me, like I'm not a free speech absolutist, and I recognize that as I said, some orthodoxy or other will be imposed. Some coercion or other will happen. The question is whether the orthodoxy is a sound one and whether the coercion is fair, is blah, 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 meets all the definitions of a sort of just order. And what I worry about is the fact that the actors who are imposing, first of all, that the orthodoxy that we're being imposed on us is irrational, like the gender stuff. And the people who are doing it aren't even legislators. There's no one elected Amazon to preside over the public square. And to say that tyranny can only be private, I apologize, that the only kind of tyranny is public tyranny. Yeah. And therefore any amount of private tyranny is like, well, it is what it is dangerous, is foolish. I'm obviously in my day job, I work for the New York Post, the paper founded by Alexander Hamilton. And we had this story about Hunter Biden that remains undisputed by Hunter Biden. Right. And it's astonishing. It was disappeared from the internet, essentially. Yep. No one, again, there's no recourse, there's no mechanism because these are large, non-governmental kind of private entities, and a certain kind of conservative will just say like, okay, well, it's private, then that's the end of the discussion. But I think a wise conservative movement, and it's happening, there are kind of movements in this direction, would see that, even on its own kind of classically liberal terms, the kind of accumulation of private power and private capital is turning the sort of rights that were supposed to be guaranteed under the Constitution, is turning into paper promises. I can go out I live in Manhattan, I can go out into the middle of, the street and bang at pots and pans and be like, Hunter Biden is corrupt, but people will think I'm a nutter and no one will pay attention to me. If the things that we value as a country really matter, they matter on these platforms. And the fact that, some unelected, dweeb making $380,000 a year at, Facebook can switch on or off your, ability to debate matters of public interest. We're not living in a free society. Right. And the fact, again, it outrages me, which is why this was a dangerous question to ask, because I'll never shut up about this, is to say like, Well, it's private. It's private.
Right.
Go build your own Facebook. Go build
Right.
your own Apple. Go build your own bank
Servers. Yeah.
servers,
Fiber optics network.
all of that. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. The
My
book
pleasure.
is the Unbroken Thread, Discovering the Wisdom of Tradition in an Age of Chaos. I'm almost done with it. I found it to be edifying and enriching. There were a couple of places where I disagree, but I suspect my review will be 90% positive. I actually felt like I was, you gave the biography of C.S. Lewis. I felt like I was reading C.S. Lewis. It felt like I was going back in time, and I was taking part in some sort of cozy fireside chat, but it was also challenging and enriching in many ways. So I want to thank you for coming on and talking to me. Now I have to sit down and pen a review to your book. I suspect it'll sell well, and I'll try to recommend it to everyone I know.
Thank you, Mr. Hill.
No problem. Bye-bye.
Be well.